Welcome, everyone, to our next Fuqua LinkedIn Live. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Melanie Wallskog. I am a professor here at Fuqua in the finance area, and I study corporate finance, labor economics, and entrepreneurship. Today, I'm going to be telling you a little bit about trends in inequality and how firms contribute to inequality in the United States. And we will have time at the end for questions. So go ahead and put any questions you have into the chat. And then at the end, we'll go through some of those. All right, let me go ahead and share my slides so that we can have those to look at. Wonderful. Okay, so as I mentioned, today I'm going to be telling you about inequality. This is going to be based on a paper of mine on the slow diffusion of earnings inequality, which means kind of earnings inequality changing over time. This is based on a paper co-authored with my colleague Isaac Sorkin at Stanford. Before we get started, I do need to say for legal purposes, the paper I'm going to show you today uses data from the U.S. Census Bureau, and effectively we've gone through all of the proper disclosures so that the results I show you are okay to show you. All right, so with that, let me go ahead and start telling you a little bit about inequality. I want to start with 3 motivating facts that really kind of inspired us to write this paper. The first fact is I think, well known. It's that inequality is rising in the United States. So as labor economists, we study inequality and we talk about inequality using different measures. I'm going to show you one here just to motivate things. That's called the 90-10 ratio. This is the ratio of income for people at the 90th percentile in the United States versus the 10th percentile. Okay, so it's kind of people who are doing quite well versus people who are further down the ranks. And you can see here from a chart from Pew that back in kind of the 80s and 90s, the ratios tended to be somewhere 9-10. Okay, so people who are at the 90th percentile earned 9 or 10 times what people at the 10th percentile earned. And there was this gap. All right. Fast forward to today, this ratio is something closer to 13 or 14, where people at that 90th percentile are now earning 13 times what people at the 10th percentile earn. All right, so this inequality is large and it's growing. All right. The second motivating fact is one that's well known within our literature, but maybe not as well known kind of to the general public, is that a lot of inequality rising over time is really about what we call between firm earnings inequality. All right, so we're going to, in this paper, take a very standard decomposition that we take in the literature, which is that we take total labor earnings inequality, and we're going to decompose that into something that's a measure of between firm inequality. That's how much firms differently pay their average worker. And then there's a second component called within firm earnings inequality, which you can think of how much does a CEO make relative to the average worker within a firm. All right. So here I'm plotting for you the different trends in these objects. The black line is the total inequality, and then we decompose that black line into within firm and between firm. And it turns out that over the last few decades, the majority of the increase in inequality is between firm. Okay, so much of the rise in inequality we see is coming from the fact that firms are paying their average workers differently. Okay, we're going to explore this pattern in the paper. Before we do that, let me introduce you to our third motivating fact, which is that employment is shifting towards older firms and firm entry has declined. All right, we're going to kind of think of this generally as a trend of declining business dynamism or changing business dynamism. The idea here is that there's fewer firms entering the market today. And this means that kind of the average worker today is at a much older, larger firm. All right, you can think of kind of big firms that you know of employ lots and lots of people. This was less so the pattern in the past. All right, just to give you an example here, I'm showing you a figure from our paper where you can look at the share of employment or the share of firms that are at firms over the age of 15, what we think of as older firms. Those are the purple lines. Those are trending up over time, versus the share of employment or firms belonging to firms under the age of 5, what we think of as young firms. Those are the blue lines. Those are declining over time. Okay, so we have a shifting kind of landscape of what firms look like in terms of age and who's entering and who's existing. And we'll be studying this component alongside inequality. So the paper's question that we are trying to answer is, why have firms increasingly paid their average workers differently? Remember, I said that this is what the trend that really accounts for the majority of the big trend of total inequality going up. We're going to basically try to understand why firms increasingly are paying their average workers differently. Okay? What we do is the following. We're going to combine these ideas from the motivating facts. We're going to take rising inequality and we're going to take that changing firm dynamics or business dynamism, and we're going to take these two patterns together and think about their interplay. To do this, we're going to use comprehensive data from the US Census Bureau that covers workers and firms. So oftentimes when you hear Census Bureau data, you might think about the decennial census, that every 10 years, the census is going to count up how many people are in the population. This is going to determine things like election districts and so forth. We're going to use a different type of data from the census. The census actually collects a ton of data on workers and firms in the US economy. And so we're going to use data that's effectively, I want you to think of as payroll data. We'll see for a handful of states that we're going to study, we'll see every employer in that state, and we'll see how many and which workers they employ every quarter and how much those workers earn. All right, so we'll see the comprehensive picture of these workers and firms in these states, which will allow us to study what's going on in terms of inequality. And we'll tie this to firm behavior and firm entry. All right? Our main finding is going to be that much of the rising dispersion in pay across firms is driven by the most recently entering firms. All right? What's happening is that firms fundamentally choose their pay setting behavior and the types of workers they hire when they enter. All right? So a new firm enters the economy. They are going to hire a certain type of people. They're going to produce a certain type of thing, and they're going to choose a compensation structure. This is then sticky over time within the firm, all right? Because managerial decisions and so forth tend to be sticky. A firm that makes its decisions when it's young will likely persist in those decisions into the future. And for some reason, which we'll talk about in a second, what that reason might be, firms that entered more recently behave differently than firms that entered in the past. These more recent entrants, the firms that entered in 2010 instead of the firms that entered in 1980, are going to pay their average worker much more differently than each other. And this will account for much of the increase in that between firm earnings inequality. All right. Now, this begs the question of why are these new entrants different? What are they doing differently? What's going on here that can account for why they pay their average worker differently? There's going to be two components. The first component is that newer entrants may pay similar workers differently. So it might be that today in these new firms, if you're a college-educated worker with a certain degree, you may earn a very different amount depending on which firm you're at. Okay, that's one component. The second component is that newer entrants also just hire different types of workers. There's an increasing in specialization. All right. For instance, in the past, the firms that entered might hire both college-educated workers and high school-educated workers. Today, firms are much more likely when they enter to specialize in just one type. Right? We're going to take these two components and think about what could be affecting them over time and what could be affecting why these newer cohorts enter differently. And we think there's several macro trends that might contribute to both. These include changing technology, which affects how labor is used. Think about some firms today are disproportionately using, capital or using the internet or something like that. That makes that their use of labor and the type of labor they demand to be quite different. We also have changing boundaries of firms, namely outsourcing, for instance. So in the past, firms would hire their own janitorial services, they would hire their own security, their own food services. Now firms are much more likely to outsource those things, and this is going to generate some mechanical inequality. We'll also have changing norms about sharing profits with workers, as well as the declining unionization and generally worker power. All of these trends are common across all firms. All firms are kind of in this big ecosystem, the big economy. All of these things are going on. But the key idea that we're going to have in our paper is that because firms make their pay setting decision when they enter, and then it's sticky with them through the rest of their life, only the new entrants fully react to these macro trends. Okay? And so we'll see that the firms who enter today take advantage of the fact that firm boundaries can be different. They take advantage of the fact that there's a less unionization, and this shapes who they hire and how they pay them. And ultimately, this drives inequality. So let me give you a little more detail on what exactly we do in our analysis. And I'm going to start by giving you a sense of what the data actually looks like. So here I'm going to plot for you some raw data. This is going to be a series of lines capturing what's happening in terms of our measure of inequality across different entry cohorts. All right, so each line is going to represent a cohort or an entry group of firms. So for instance, the firms that entered in 1993 versus the firms that entered in 2010. Those are all those different lines. What we're doing here is we're plotting, again, our measure of how much firms pay their average worker differently. This is our between firm earnings measure. And we'll see two patterns in this raw data. The first is that within a cohort, so within a line, inequality falls across the life cycle. All right, we kind of seem to see a declining trend within a line over time. As a cohort ages, they actually pay workers more similarly. The second pattern, which is going to be the important one, is that across cohorts, across those lines, inequality seems to increase. Namely, those lines seem to stack up on each other and ratchet upward. The firms that entered more recently enter with much more dispersion in how they pay their average workers, and it stays that way across their life cycle. All right? What we're going to do in our paper is effectively mathematically study these patterns. So we're going to basically apply a bunch of econometric techniques, statistical techniques, in order to understand these patterns in a more robust way. How we do this is that we'll decompose inequality into three parts. First, there will be year patterns that affect all firms operating in the same year. Think of this as common time trends, common things that are happening in the economy. The second component will be age patterns, which affect all firms of the same age. Perhaps young firms are hit differently behave differently than old firms. All right. The third and most important component it will turn out is those cohort patterns, which affect all firms that entered in the same year. All right. And so what we'll do in our analysis, I'm not going to show you the details today for time, but we'll go ahead and we'll basically estimate how much these different components matter. And it will turn out that the cohort effects, the fact that newer entrants have much more dispersion, much more inequality, those patterns are going to account for the majority of rising inequality. All right. What exactly do these patterns mean? Well, we see again that firms that entered more recently pay their average workers more differently. All right. Effectively, think of it as, for some reason or reasons, firms that entered in the 2010s behave differently than firms that entered in the 1980s. Why exactly is this happening? In the paper, we'll effectively provide some evidence consistent with a bunch of stories. Frankly, there's a lot of things going on. Some likely differences include that more recent entrants do seem to specialize more in whom they hire. For instance, college-age educated workers are much more clustered in certain firms that enter today relative to other firms. So as I said before, today, if you take a set of firms that enter, you're much more likely to find a firm that's all college-educated workers or a firm that's all high school-educated workers and less of a mixture of the two. This is going to generate mechanically higher inequality when we think about between firm earnings inequality, since we know that college-educated workers tend to earn more than high school-educated workers. But we also see that more recent entrants are just different types of firms. They're behaving differently. They operate and produce in different ways that use labor differently. For instance, we'll see that these firms are going to be much more dispersed in a measure of productivity that we use, which is revenue per worker. We'll see that in these newer sets of firms, there are going to be some firms that seemingly can produce a lot of revenue with very little labor, and other firms that use much more labor to produce the same revenue. This might be about changing technology or how they actually produce. It could also be about outsourcing and kind of using labor from other sources beyond your own workers. All right. Now, why does this all matter? There's going to be two conclusions for the paper. The first is going to be related to this figure I'm showing you here. we can take our estimates and project into the future after the span of data that we have. And we'll argue that as those more recent entrants, those more recent cohorts of firms, as they grow, and as newer firms enter the market into the future, we expect a continued rise in earnings inequality. So just to give you an example, here we're basically doing an exercise where the solid line is data. Those are our actual inequality measures. And we're going to project forward with those dashed lines what we think is going to happen in the future in terms of earnings inequality. We have two lines here because we're going to do basically two different assumptions. We think the truth is somewhere in the middle. And effectively, we expect earnings inequality to continue to increase as these newer firms that are much more dispersed in how they pay workers, as they grow and as newer sets enter as well. The second component that matters a lot here is that there's an important welfare challenge. Even if all of this between firm earnings inequality growth could be coming from just in the past, college and high school educated workers worked together, now they work apart. That's somewhat of a mechanical increase in inequality, but it's going to turn out that firms matter a lot more for you than just your pay. You can imagine in your job that yes, you get pay, but you also get other benefits. Some of these benefits will include things like health insurance, will include things like maybe flexibility or parental leave and so forth. And these benefits tend to be better at higher paying firms. So it's important when we think about inequality in pay that we also think about inequality in other aspects. And as, for instance, high school educated workers are increasingly shut out from these high paying firms, they're also increasingly shut out from better benefits. All right. Now, with that, I'm going to have time for questions. I see I actually already have one from Aditi Dash. So let me go ahead and answer that. But if you have any other questions, put them in the chat and I will be more than happy to answer them. All right. So Aditi said, how has it been inferred that there's a decline in unionization of workers and a decline in workers' power? If you just look at total unionization of kind of the ratio of workers who are covered by unions, that has declined over time. Part of this is mechanical because unionization traditionally, historically, was very large in sectors like manufacturing that have also just declined over time. And so just fewer workers are in these sorts of businesses. But that said, even within a sector, unionization has declined. Now, that said, we're seeing obviously recent trends of relatively successful or promising union strikes. And so this is not necessarily guaranteed to be a forever thing, but we generally think in this literature that unionization has declined, and with it, there's a decline in worker power. Now, some workers are going to have lots of power, and so we might think that this is going to really affect some workers differently from others, which might be another reason why you'd be concerned about inequality if the kind of most vulnerable populations have the least power. Okay. I'll mention, because we're on the topic of unionization, we don't think that unionization declining is really driving the vast majority of this trend. We think it's important, but we can actually estimate our results across different sectors, for instance, and we'll see that this pattern of newer entrants being much more dispersed is really common across all different types of sectors, not just sectors where unions historically were important. So we'll also see big declines in services and so forth that are not traditionally covered by unions. And so it turns out that it's going to be a mix of different factors. We have a question from Gianluca. Why are the pay setting policies so hard to change once they have been established within a firm when the firm first enters the market? This is tricky because we don't actually observe the direct pay setting policies. We just see that pay seems to be sticky within a firm over time. There's a lot of literature in the management literature that effectively says it's really hard to change things once you've made your decisions. Part of this is kind of behavioral biases. People make decisions and then we say, okay, we made those decisions, let me stick to them. But also some of this is about worker norms. If you've already committed to paying your workers a high amount, it's really hard to cut their wages. Similarly, if you decided early on that you're only going to hire high school educated workers and you'll specialize in that area, it's just really costly to kind of totally change your plan down the road. Effectively, firms are going to make decisions that are value maximizing, and they're going to make those decisions based on expectations of the future when they're young. Whether those decisions are the right ones or not for them, they will make those decisions. And because of these behavioral biases, as well as just the fact that changing is costly, these things will tend to be persistent over time. Okay. Wonderful. Well, please go ahead and put any questions you have in the chat, or sorry, in the LinkedIn chat. But I can tell you a little bit more about other outcomes we look at. One of the kind of surprising surprising findings to us, or at least ones that we didn't know about, but once we talked to people in this particular literature, it is an important pattern, is that as we look at these cohorts that are more unequal in how they pay workers, they're also just more unequal in who they hire. And this is not just about, as I mentioned, college-educated workers. It's also going to be happening for instance, segregation based on race and gender. So it turns out that workplaces are more segregated on race today than they were 20 years ago. And part of this is that these firms seem to be not necessarily specializing in any sort of biased way, but they're just hiring workers in particular occupations that tend to be more racially homogeneous. And you can imagine that, as we all know, it's really important to have diversity and interact with people from different cultures and different backgrounds. This can be another way in which kind of changing dynamics over time can be potentially costly. I'll also mention, because I talked about kind of the fact that these cohorts that entered more recently behaving very differently, I also had motivated at the very beginning that we saw this decline in new entrants. And so we actually, when we wrote this paper, expected a different pattern. We thought that, hey, we see that there's fewer new entrants today. It's really about these old firms that are big and they're growing and they account for so much more employment today. We thought that that was where we would see the high inequality. But no, it really turns out to be, even though they're a small fraction of firms, these new firms that enter who are behaving so differently. We have another question. What could invert this trend in the future? And do you think the regulator should play a role? It is difficult to think about how trends will change in the future, and especially to think about what the role of policy is here. For example, we can think about, well, let's suppose that all firms are just value maximizing. They are just choosing when they enter the best setup for them. It's not obvious that that's something that a regulator should intervene on. I think where it's important to think about the role for policy is to think about all those benefits that come with being at a high-paying firm. So, for example, the fact that some people may increasingly be cut off from firms that have good healthcare might be an argument for universal health coverage. We have a question from Sam. How do you think the recent trends and laws on pay transparency will or will not make a difference? It's interesting. There's quite some different results in the literature on how pay transparency affects things. We know from some literature that when pay is more transparent, people will effectively be able to bargain better and know kind of how they stack up relative to others. We also know that sometimes if you're confronted with the fact that perhaps your boss makes much more than you, this can actually really reduce motivation naturally, which will then reduce productivity. And this will then feed into prices and wages. Generally speaking, we do think that pay transparency can be really good to give people power and the ability to bargain for themselves, especially when they don't have a union bargaining for them. But one of the very important components of pay transparency and the rules around pay transparency is that a lot of pay that the richest of the rich amongst workers earn is actually not labor earnings. And so a lot of it's going to be difficult to quantify if we look at equity pay, if we look at other different perks that are frequently difficult to quantify. These will be less salient. And so we'll have to see if pay transparency simply leads to people shifting how they're compensated in ways that could actually increase inequality. We'll see kind of going into the future. Ultimately, it's going to be an empirical question of how these patterns change. And back to Jean-Luc's question, we could think that this trend could diminish if there was a reason for firms to, for instance, hire more similar or more different types of workers. So, for instance, if you had regulation that reduced offshoring of labor to lower labor cost economies in Latin America or China, for instance, if you forced companies to hire American workers or workers working on American soil, this could lead to some changes, some declines in the inequality that we see. Okay, wonderful. What I'll say at the end of the day is that inequality is a very large topic. We're going to measure in this paper and in our work labor earnings inequality. Ultimately, we want to speculate about welfare inequality and consumption inequality. We know from a vast literature that these things tend to be correlated. If you have high earnings, you tend to also have high savings and high assets. But ultimately, where we'd love to see the literature going forward is blending these things together and understanding their interplay. Some of this is frankly just difficult to study because what we see in our data is only labor earnings, and we don't see capital earnings, for instance. But hopefully into the future, we'll have more data and we'll be able to understand when firms, for instance, pay workers relatively more versus relatively less. What does this mean for their savings? What does this mean for their consumption? Who are they kind of forming families with? Are they having children? Are they buying houses? All these sorts of things that really go into the welfare equation of how people, how people are doing in their lives. But we'll see going into the future as that data is available. Okay. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for all being here. It was great to get your questions. Please join us for our next LinkedIn Live on November 1st at 12:30 p.m. with Professor Christine Moorman. She'll be discussing the latest results on the CMO survey. But thank you so much for your attention, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.